Alhamdulillah, Alhamdulillahi wa kafa wa salamun ala ibadihi alladhina istafa. Amma ba'd. That's us at the end of the second Ashra. May Allah Azza wa Jal make it so that we are among the consequences of having been forgiven and not having been forgiven. You see, فَيَغْفِرُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيُعَذِّبُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. It's really in Allah's hands. If He wills, He will forgive. And if He wills, He will punish. And He has the qudra and ability to do this. In fact, in the closing verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, there is a very intense message of Allah's power and might and knowledge and qudra and His absolute kingdom. And to understand this point, we can reflect on the kingdoms, the governments of this dunya. You can associate strong governance with three attributes. One is the domain. What is the region which is under the authority of a government? What are those frontiers, borders? To where, to what extent does the governance extend? So the authority, where does it reach? Number one. Number two, how powerful is the government? What resources does it have? Is it a weak government or a strong one? Its military strength, its political strength. Number three, the third one is knowledge. Governments collect data, as they must. And they've done this since the beginning of humanity. They need information about their own subjects, whether this is done covertly or overtly, through Big Brother, through TV, through cameras, or whether it's done discreetly. Governments always have intelligence arrangements, facilities, people, personnel. So if there's any one but not the other, or any two and not the third, if, for example, there's a lot of military power, but there's no knowledge, the government will collapse. We've seen entire, historically, empires we've seen collapse because of a lack of knowledge. Or, even where there's been power, military power. The USSR is a recent example in modern history. Or sometimes, you have an example where there's plenty of power, there's plenty of knowledge, but there isn't any power. So a lack of actual ability, resources, technology, etc. And sometimes the domain and terrain is very limited. But when it comes to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. He owns everything in the heavens and the earth, without exception. And they are actually His property. Governments don't own their subjects. They don't own everything in their countries. They are private possessions. They just govern over them. But Allah actually owns everything. And Allah Ta'ala has absolute knowledge. وَإِن تُبْدُوا مَا فِي أَنفُسِكُمْ أَوْ تُخْفُوهُ يُحَاسِبُكُمْ بِهِ اللَّهِ. If you openly express what is in your hearts, or you keep it concealed, Allah will take hisab. Because He can, He knows what's in your heart. He doesn't need to watch over you with a third party. He knows what's actually in your heart. And so there are no secrets from Allah. The knowledge is absolute. Wallahu ala kulli shay'in qadir. فَيَغْفِرُ لِمَنْ يَشَاءُ وَيُعَذِّبُ مَنْ يَشَاءُ وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ قَدِيرٌ. He has qudra over everything. So my friends, Allah's kingdom is absolute. And He will forgive whom He wills, and He will punish whom He wills. And if He wants to, He can punish for a single sin, and that can become the source of our destruction. And if He wants to, He can accept a single good deed, And that can be our salvation. And so this is why the pious are always in this state, بين الخوف والرجاء, between hope and fear. They are never overconfident, nor are they despondent, nor do they despair. They're always in between hope and fear. And this is where Iman lies. Although the ulama say that in reality, the stages of our life, in youth, in the passions of youth, it is appropriate that if there's to be an edge of one over the other, it should be fear over hope. That fear will hold us back. It'll rein us back. And in old age, as one approaches one's autumn years and one is waiting essentially for that final moment and approaching it, perhaps approaching it quickly, they can see it coming, then there should be a dominance of hope in those days and in those moments. But moving on, yes, and before we do, second Ashura, this is the last night of the second Ashura, and the last Ashura, which is associated with Itq min an-nar, freedom from the fire. This Ashura is the one in which it's Sunnah Mu'akkada. It's the perpetual Sunnah of our Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam, almost every single year after the Hijrah, to perform i'tikaf. And so if you haven't already done so, and you have an opportunity to, then do join us, insha'Allah, for i'tikaf for these last 10 days, this last Ashura, 9-10 days, so that we can use every moment, and we can, the other day, this brother phoned, he says, my wife saw a dream, and he says, I was reading Quran in the place I usually read Quran, and the angels are coming down and doing salam to me. And he says, what's the interpretation? And it says, the interpretation is, تَنَزَّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالرُّوحُ فِيهَا بِإِذْنِ رَبِّهِمْ مِنْ كُلِّ أَمْرٍ سَلَامٍ. Inshallah, you will be granted Laylatul Qadr this year. This is the interpretation. But what about the rest of us? We all want Laylatul Qadr. Which night is it going to be? And so this is why we ought to take this opportunity. I was actually going to speak about a different ayat, but now I can see you're intrigued with the interpretation of the dream. So let's go to the dream mentioned in today's recitation. Yes? And this is the dream of Allah's Rasul Ibrahim alayhi salatu wassalam, when he said to his son, Ya bunayya, inni ara fil manami, anni adhbahuka, fanzur madha tara. قال افعل ما تؤمر ستجدني إن شاء الله من الصابرين. Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam relates his dream to his son Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, there are 3 types of dreams. The first type of dream is referred to as adghathu ahlam, just random thoughts, as is mentioned in Surah Yusuf, when the king saw a dream and his ministers told him, these are just random thoughts, although his dream was a true one. Random thoughts. And these thoughts are a consequence of our stream of conscience, our thoughts in our mind and heart, our subconscious mind. Whatever you do your day, whatever you spend your day doing, will come back to you through the night. And so these dreams have no meaning. They don't have any meaning. They are of no significance. The second type of dream is from shaitan. And these are the dreams that you might refer to as nightmares, scary dreams, frightening dreams. These too have no significance and should not be narrated or related to anybody. We learn from the hadith that if you see something which you don't approve of, you don't like, then you should say, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, and you should, towards your left side, make a spitting sound towards shaitan, and then turn over and go back to sleep. Sometimes a person has nightmares and bad dreams because of their food. If you have a late meal and you layer it on the pizza and the cheesecake and the ice cream, then what's going to happen? And then you go to bed. You're going to hallucinate. You don't need to take drugs. The gases inside your stomach will rise up to your head and you'll see frightening dreams. This is easily possible. My Shaykh, rahimahullah, he mentioned that a man came to him and he says, I go to sleep And I get the sense that someone's sitting on my chest and I can't move. And he'd been told that he had a jinn problem. And Sheikh says to him, he says, what time do you have your meal? He says, late. And Sheikh said, start missing your nighttime meal. Don't eat at that time. Just have some fruit and then go for a walk at nighttime before you go to bed in the evening. After some days, the problem was resolved. And the Sheikh explained, it's just your diet. It gets into your system, the gases rise up and you hallucinate. You don't need to take magic mushrooms. Allah protect from those experiments. Huh? So, the third type of dream is the true dream. And this is the dream which is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anbiya's dreams are true and absolute. And they know that they are from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's a form of wahi. And in fact, this is why, even for the rest of us, it is not permissible to make up a dream. It's a sin, a major sin in fact. And a person who fabricates a dream will be given an impossible task to do on the day of Qiyamah, because he's attributed something to Allah which was impossible for him. You can't force a dream on yourself. So he'll be given a grain, a seed, a grain of corn or wheat, and he'll be told to tie it into a knot, which you can't do. He'll be given an impossible task. He'll be obliged to do something which is beyond him, because in the dunya he tried to attribute something to Allah which was beyond him. So we must be careful about how we relate dreams. And so the third type of dream is a true dream. And Ibrahim alayhi salam's dream was true, and he saw in his dream that he was sacrificing his son Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam, a live, living, human sacrifice of blood. Subhanallah. Now, of course, that can't and doesn't apply to the rest of us, because our dreams or intuitions are not wahi, and this is not permissible for us, because Allah hasn't commanded us to do that. But this was a command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam. Now, how and why is this possible? Let me mention here that the only one for whom a blood sacrifice is allowed is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In fact, even in today's recitation, we heard of Sulaiman alayhi salatu wasalam and the horses. This is another story for another day, when the sun set before Asr was performed. But this is the point, that everything has been made for us, the sun and the moon and the stars and the vegetation and the animals. Everything has been put into our service. The night and the day has been made musakhar for our service. But we have been reserved for the ibadah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So we can use everything to our advantage in an appropriate way, but the only one for which anything will be sacrificed is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so at the top of the hierarchy is the human being, and the human being bows down only before Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And the honor of this bowing down is so great that if Allah demands this from us, and He hasn't, then it would be appropriate and befitting. And so Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam responds. He says, Ya abati fa'al ma tu'mar, my father, do as you've been told, as you've been instructed. Satajiduni, and he fulfills this sunnah of the Anbiya, insha'Allah. You'll find me, insha'Allah, if Allah wills. Minas sabirin, from the patient. And so Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, and it's a long story, he takes Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam to Mina, and he lays him down, and he attempts to perform the action which he's been commanded to do. And this is when وَفَدَيْنَاهُ بِذِبْحٍ عَظِيمٍ, Allah Azza wa Jal sends an animal from Jannah. A male goat is sent down. And Allah Ta'ala gives this in lieu. Now this is an interesting point, a subtle point here. Why was the animal sent from Jannah? The ulama and the mufassirin say this is because there's an aspect of the soil of Jannah in the fabric and material of the bodies of the Anbiya alayhimu salatu wasalam. This is another subject as well for another time. But it's not surprising that our Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam's sweat smelt of perfume and musk. So this animal was slaughtered in place of Ismail alayhi salam as a ransom and fidya. And this is in the time of Ibrahim alayhi salam, but its horns were secured and saved as a tabarruk, as a reminder. And they were hung in the Kaaba. And they were there in the time of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. In fact, they were there in the time of the Khulafa, Abu Bakr, Umar, Uthman, Ali radiyallahu anhu. And they were there when Abdullah ibn Zubayr radiyallahu anhuma was the governor of the region of Hijaz. But unfortunately, when Hajjaj bin Yusuf held Makkah under siege and missiles were fired into the Haram, this caused a fire, and these horns were burnt and they were lost to history. Otherwise, today when we would go to the Haram, we would be able to see them. The horns of this goat which came from Jannah in lieu of Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam. And so Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam was not slaughtered, and the goat was slaughtered on his behalf. And Allah Azza wa Jal gave Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam success in this test. And let me just mention another subtle aspect here before we conclude. You know, this whole silsila, Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam is one of the forefathers of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. His lineage reaches Ismail alayhi salam, and it reaches Ibrahim alayhi salam. And if we go back, it reaches various Anbiya, it reaches Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. And so, if we go through history, all of the events which happen with various Anbiya, the ulama say that there's a subtlety behind the ark and the safety of the people on the ark with Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam. And it was because essentially Nuh alayhi salatu wasalam was carrying in his spinal cord the nutfa of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And if we go further, if we look at Ibrahim alayhi salatu wasalam, the fire didn't burn him, he was carrying the nutfa of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. And Ismail alayhi salatu wasalam was not sacrificed by the knife. It is on his neck, and Allah instructs it not to cut because he was carrying the nutfa of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wasallam. So this is the barakah of our Nabi sallallahu alayhi wasallam in a subtle sense, that Allah made it possible for that entire lineage to be preserved. And finally, when Allah Ta'ala mentions the laying down of Ismail on the ground, فَلَمَّا أَسْلَمَا وَتَلَّهُ لِلْجَبِينِ, when Ibrahim alayhi salam lay Ismail alayhi salam on his temple, on the ground, meaning the side of the head. And Allah Ta'ala, when He mentions this, He says, and He mentions the sending down of the animal, Allah Ta'ala says, فَلَمَّا أَسْلَمَا, when Ibrahim and Ismail submitted. The word Islam is used here, submission. So this is what it is, my friends. When Ibrahim alayhi salam laid Ismail down, and when Ismail alayhi salam allowed himself to be laid down, there was no logic or rationale behind this. Why would a father place a knife on his son's neck? But there was another level of logic and rationale. You know, it's about your head and your heart. And when it comes to Iman, then even if your head doesn't make sense of what's being asked of you, your heart is the one who's in the lead, if there's true Iman. And this is the spirit of Islam. We're not being asked to do what Ibrahim alayhi salam was asked to do. But we are being asked to accept with our hearts what Allah has told us to do, regardless of whether our heads understand or not. And this is the spirit of Deen. And so, my friends, the preservation of Iman relies upon an absence of objection. Why? Why did Allah ask me to do this? No. If you have submitted, then you must submit absolutely. Udkhulu fis silmi kaffa. Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, udkhulu fis silmi kaffa. O believers, enter into Islam fully. وَلَا تَتَّبِعُوا خُطُوَاتِ الشَّيْطَانِ, and don't walk in the footsteps of shaitan. Meaning, if you don't submit fully, then you are walking in the footsteps of shaitan with one foot in and one foot out. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us tawfiq to understand. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين.